are listening to a free version of Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
The Majority Report with Sam Steeder.
It is Monday, August 19th, 2019. My name is Sam Steeder. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Professor of History at Monash University in Australia, author of Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America, Joshua Specht will be with us. Also on the program today, federal court allows the Trump ban on abortion referrals to go forward while lawsuits continue. Could mean loss of millions of dollars to women's health providers across the country. Rural areas particularly hit hard. Meanwhile, Trump's forced attendance rally backfires. 3 potential mass shootings foiled this weekend. Nice. Bernie releases a massive criminal justice proposal, and Joe Biden realizes his mouth is a liability. Hong Kong sees 1.7 million people, that's 1/4 of their population, march in the pouring rain this weekend in protest. New report, CEO pay has grown almost 1,000% in the past 30 years.
Doing a lot of good work.
Yours, I feel quite confident in saying, has not. Meanwhile, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and 4 other Democratic senators declare war on the Supreme Court of the United States. And removing a stigma, Atlanta makes school lunch free to all students. Lastly, in a national survey of economists, 74% say a recession likely by late 2021. As data shows, the tax cut was indeed a total scam. And lastly, leaked Proud Boy chats show they were plotting violence. Surprise, surprise, surprise. All this and more on today's program, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, hope you had a good weekend. Followed all that stuff that happened in Portland this weekend via Twitter. Fortunately, not no significant violence of any sort. The Proud Boys were severely outnumbered by anti-fascist, Antifa protesters, and somehow the Proud Boys were able to have a non-permitted march with protection from the cops, and the Antifa people not so much, but nevertheless, no major violence. Let's get into this, shall we, ladies and gentlemen? Just a reminder, couple of just house cleaning things. Next week, we're going to be on vacation. There will be all new recorded interviews, which you will enjoy. And if you want to get a brief fix on the news of the day, our AM Quickie is the best way to do this. It's sort of like my headlines that I read at the front, but it's a little bit more in-depth in a couple of stories and not quite as many stories. But you'll get a sense of where the news is without having to get too deep into it. Every day on the Majority Report feed, you simply go and subscribe to the Majority Report. You don't need the members feed or anything like that. Just go on to iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or your podcast app audio only. Go in, subscribe. It will come to you in the morning, hopefully by 9, often before then, but we try and get it out the door by 8:30 or so, but we'll see. I will still be doing it on vacation.
Really?
Yep.
Ow.
Yep.
What about your co-host? Will she as well?
She will be too.
All right.
She is not on vacation, but I will be on vacation.
Yes. Heavy on the quotation.
There you
I
go.
would like you to take an actual vacation.
Yeah, well,
at
that's
some
pretty
point.
good. I mean, it doesn't take long to do, and so there may be screaming children in the background. We'll see.
That would be interesting acoustics.
Speaking of which, in studio today, we may have a guest. I've hired someone to do a little bit of organizing around the office, and her name is Mila Cedar. She may actually hop on the microphones. Also, a reminder, if you want to become a member of this program, it's very easy. Go to jointhemajorittyreport.com. Your support makes this show possible. So there's quite a bit of talk about a recession. Largely as the world goes, so do we, in many respects. And there's a couple of things to note before we hear Donald Trump pretend that it's not happening. One of the things that people are pointing to is this yield in the or inverse yield inverse in the yield curve, which basically means, I'm going to do broad strokes here because frankly I only have a rudimentary understanding of this. Long-term interest rates are rising above, and this only happened very briefly, I guess, for like an hour or two the other day. But every other time it's happened, 50 times, it has been predictive of a recession. Long-term interest rates rose above short-term interest rates, which basically means that people have concerns about the economy down the road, that that's basically what it is. I mean, it has to do with treasury bills and where investors think that safe places to go are and what yields will be, et cetera, et cetera. But that's the long and short of it. It happened very briefly, so who knows? The big concern, though, however, is that the Fed does not have much ability to lower interest rates more than they have, which is a tool that you need to fight a recession. The other tool that you could use would be government spending, which, of course, there's going to be massive reluctance to do it, particularly if a Democrat comes into office in 2021. They're going to use the excuse of this massive deficit and debt to say that cuts have to be taking place. And you could raise taxes on the very wealthy, pour that money back into the economy in a myriad of different ways, but unlikely that, the politics would have to be pretty different than they've been in the past 30 years. There's a report out today, CNBC, writes about economists who have examined the impact of the 2017 Tax Cuts and Job Act say it isn't helping in any of the ways advertised. Overall growth, business investment, or worker pay, all flatlined. The tax cuts have not generated the promised growth of 3% or more. There was an uptick. Then some of that stuff was revised down. We've already seen the bulk of it. A Congressional Research Service analysis. I want you to remember this because this is exactly what happened in Kansas. Now, in Kansas, it destroyed them because they don't have the ability to print money and borrow money. They have to balance their budget every year. But the argument is if we cut taxes, revenue will actually go up from taxes because there'll be so much more business activity that more money will come in. Complete disaster in Kansas. So much so that a fully Republican legislature voted to increase taxes 3 years later because it was so devastating, 4 years later. A Congressional Research Service analysis concluded that the law has produced, are you ready for this? Because when I say to you, I'm going to cut taxes and we're going to make more in revenue, that means that tax revenue, after I cut the rate of taxes, is actually going to come in at like 101% or 105% or 110% of what we cut in terms of taxes. The Research Service, Congressional Research Analysis conclude the law has produced no more than 5% of the growth needed to offset the tax cut losses. So they missed it by that much. Are both my hands out of frame? Because that's the only way to communicate this. Here is Donald Trump. When asked about the economy, he thinks it's like a tennis match with China for some reason.
I don't see a recession. I mean, the world is in a recession right now. And although that's too big a statement, but if you look at China, China's doing very, very poorly. They've had, I just saw a report, they've had the worst year they've had in 27 years because of what I've done. And they want to come to the negotiating table. You know, they're having companies lose. I mean, they're leaving. The companies are leaving. And they're laying off millions of people because they don't want to pay 25%. And that's why they want to come to the table. I don't think there's another reason other than President Xi, I'm sure, likes me very much. But they're losing millions and millions of jobs in China. And we're not paying for the tariffs. China is paying for the tariffs for the 100th time. And I understand tariffs very well. Other countries, it may be that if I do things with other countries, but in the case of China, China is eating the tariffs, at least so far.
Might be a pivot time later today.
Right.
When I say
right.
So far, because I don't actually want a recession.
Right. Slight lack of understanding of the global implications.
We have an incredibly interdependent economy with China, which is why if they do bad, we do bad.
Everybody said when I wanted to start trading with Mars that it was pie in the sky, that now we have a backup. Don't need China. Have Mars.
It's a great signal for our economy that China is shedding jobs and having extreme instability.
So
that's exactly what you want with a prime trade partner.
People are a little skeptical about Donald Trump and his grasp on these things. So who better to send out to assure us all that there's no recession coming?
A steady hand.
Than the guy who was famous for being the biggest booster of the stock market and the economy about 9 months before it had its biggest crash since the Great Depression. I will say this. This must have been pre-taped because this aired at 10 a.m. And later in the program, we're going to play a performance of his at 10:30 a.m. And there's simply, unless they have one of those beer funnels in this studio, there's no way he could have had this type of evolution, let's say.
Which is not to say that this is going to be sober.
Right, which is... I'm just saying that it takes usually a couple hours to get that. But I don't know. Here he is.
Chuck, one last point.
Okay.
Low interest rates, which is across the spectrum, is a very good thing for housing, for construction, for automobile sales. So low interest rates, no inflation, virtually no inflation, Chuck Todd. So I actually think it's a pretty good story. And again, let me echo my theme. Let's not be afraid of some optimism.
Okay, you say that, but you actually said that in 2007, right before the second worst downturn in American history. This is what you wrote. There's no recession coming. This is in December of 2007. The pessimistas were wrong. It's not going to happen. The Bush boom is alive and well. It's finishing up its sixth consecutive year with more to come. The more to come was a massive downturn. So I admire your optimism, but the data is pointing in another direction.
Well, I plead guilty to that late 2007 forecast. I plead guilty. By the way, every other forecaster, CBO,
you weren't alone. You weren't
OMB,
alone. That's
Blue
right.
Chip,
You weren't alone.
They were all there. However, just a wee bit of Kudlow defense now. By February and March,
I said we
on CNBC in those days. I did go to the recession call, so I will plead that I did see it. I don't know that anybody saw that kind of crash. But look, this is not then.
Pause. I just want to make it clear. It's not a question. First of all, there was a lot of people who saw a crash. A lot of people actually saw a major crash. I know this because I was talking about it. And if I was talking about it with only really an ability to read other people in terms of the economy, then clearly there were people talking about it. But let's not make a mistake here. He didn't say there's a chance for a slight downturn. He said we're in booming. And this guy was out there, optimism every day on TV. Every day.
That's the Bush boom. Great time to buy a derivative. Chuck Todd.
Here's the irony. That was when he was more sober, despite the fact his analysis was less sober. As it were. I'm speaking metaphorically. Continue.
Look, this is not then. Our banks are well capitalized. Our financial system's in very good shape. And I must say, as the president is transforming and rebuilding this economy, he deserves enormous credit. A new policy of lower taxes and regulation and energy opening and trade reform. We didn't quite get to 3%, but look, Chuck, the first 2 years of the Obama administration, we were just a hair below 3%.
Okay.
We're moving in the same direction.
Did you just call it the Obama administration? Did he just call it the Obama administration?
I think that's what he said.
We didn't quite get to 3%, but look, Chuck, the first 2 years of the Obama administration, we were just a hair below 3%.
Okay.
We're moving in the same direction. And let's be honest
What
here.
is he talking about? In the
faced
first 2 years?
Growth under Obama.
I'm talking
In the first 2 years of the Obama administration,
growth.
we were in a deep recession.
Yeah.
Oh, we were in a recession.
So he
Sam
must be
Cedar?
talking about the Trump administration.
Oh, you must be Nostradamus.
Well,
Hey.
look, bottom line, we don't need to see any more of this because the really sad stuff will happen.
Lushad.
But the real problem, I think he's right to a certain extent that we don't have the same exposure in terms of the financial system, although who knows, but more than likely not. The problem is there is no slack. There is no room. And in the event that there is a downturn, I mean, we can spend, but you know, if a Democrat is elected president, all of these guys who don't care about the $1 trillion deficit, debt right now, they're going to be freaking out about this stuff.
I'm going to downturn this shot into my face, Chuck Todd.
All right. We got to get to this stuff. Will you let our guests know we're going to be a little bit late? This is good. I like doing ads like this because we have been advertising for Quip for several years, and now I just wait for the testimonials to roll in. What's the easiest way to ease back into a routine? Simplify mornings and evenings with an electric toothbrush from Quip. It's back to school time, folks. It's time Sonic Vibrations offer an effective clean that's gentle on your sensitive gums in just 2 minutes, twice a day. The multi-use cover works as a stand. It mounts to mirrors. It's great for traveling. Puts your brush front and center in your bathroom. And better yet, the lightweight, compact design means that you can take it with you, not just on trips, but out and about on the town. But also traveling with it is huge because you keep your routine. Brush heads are automatically delivered on a dentist-recommended schedule every 3 months for just $5, making it easy to stay committed to your oral health. Folks, you know why I love Quip. I'll just sum it up. Gave one to my sister. I was quipping it. That's when I came up with that myself. And I gave one to my sister, Betsy. She texted me out of the blue. I mean, I had sort of forgotten I had given it to her. She texted me out of the blue. My dentist wanted me to thank you for giving me that quip. Says that my teeth are noticeably in better shape. What more do you need? The bottom line is oral hygiene. The key is to do it every day and to do it well. And the quip is designed both in terms of its shape and its ease and its placement on your sink or on your mirror, and with the timer to get you to do it every day. That's the key with this stuff. And that's why I love Quip and why it's perfect for getting back into a routine. Quip starts at just $25. To get yours, go to getquip.com/majority right now. You can get your first refill pack free. That's your first refill pack free at getquip.com/majority. So also, support from today's show comes from Embark, which is the most accurate dog DNA test kit on the market. Now, for non-dog owners, probably unclear why you would want a dog DNA test kit. Kelly has been using one with Edie. She says the whole process has been incredibly easy. She's super psyched about finding out about Edie, but there's more to it than just the ease of the use. I mean, as to the value of it. She says it's super easy, but after we did the first Embark ad, we got an email from somebody who I guess is overseas. They're in Britain. And he wrote in, my younger brother and best mate is 19 now. He was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome when he was 5. He struggled for many years with significant anxiety, and his unique spirit and character was misunderstood by his peers for years. Things were tough, and despite our best efforts, we felt hopeless in trying to support him. We knew he had so much to give to the world, but couldn't find a way to support him to do so. For his 12th birthday, we adopted a golden retriever for him, which he named Gregor Samsa. Matt, right? The misunderstood,
Metamorphosis.
isolated, malign protagonist from Kafka's The Metamorphosis. Since Gregor came along, my brother has never looked back. Almost immediately, he had someone who understood him, who he understood. Gregor gave him confidence, comfort, critically a way for him to meet new people without stressing about what to say or do straight away. In short, Gregor has become absolutely essential part of our family. We couldn't imagine where my brother would be had he not come along. At 7, Gregor is getting on. He's happy and healthy at the moment, but our vet recently suggested we get a DNA test to make sure we know what to expect and take all precautions. We chose Embark DNA because of its reputation and positive reviews, its simplicity of delivery and return, the fact that it tests for over 170 plus health conditions. The service was brilliant. And my brother loved learning more about his best friend. More importantly, our vet has tailored Gregor's diet in line with genetic predispositions, the results identified, giving us the confidence we're doing all we can to make sure Gregor is around for as long as possible. A dog DNA test may sound silly or like a novelty or a luxury. For us, it has been a way of showing our love and support to a complete member of our family. Sorry for the length, but absolutely cannot recommend Embark DNA enough.
It's beautiful.
Cheers. I mean,
that's amazing.
Yeah. It's nuts. So Embark has an exclusive summer offer for our listeners. Go to embarkvet.com. Use the promo code majority. Save 15% off your dog DNA test kit. You can discover your dog more than fur deep. Visit Embark, EMBARK, vet, VET.com. Use promo code majority to save. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Joshua Specht about our Red Meat Republic. We are back. Sam Cedar on the Majority Report on the phone. It is a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of History at Monash University in Melbourne. I think I messed that up. Monash.
No, that was close enough.
Okay. And author of Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America. Joshua Specht, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, so just the era that we're talking about, you follow this basically starting from the 1800s through the early 20th century, right?
Yeah.
Just tell us why beef? Why beef as a way of or what that tells us, I guess, about the way that America was developed, particularly the sort of the political economy?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, at first the why beef, when I started writing this book, I was just curious about it. And then what I discovered as I looked more and more about how beef was produced, that it tied into all these big stories at the heart of what it means to be American, but also at the heart of the American economy. So we think about the stories of the American West. Cattle ranching is obviously everywhere. We think about the history of cowboys. They're essentially cattle workers, as I talk about them. But also, the model for big industrial agriculture is pioneered by meatpackers, often working with beef in Chicago. So what I see is a set of 4 firms headquartered in Chicago. You can think of Chicago as kind of the Silicon Valley of its day. And they remake both agriculture in the United States, but in a way industrial production. They pioneer things like the assembly line, or for them, a disassembly line.
Okay, so let's start with this notion of the. Are you there?
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Let's start with the notion of the cattle ranch, and you know you write that basically beef becomes or meat becomes a tool for conquest in some ways, and also a justification for one. Explain that dynamic.
Yeah, I think you've gotten to the heart of it. So if you think about the kind of far west in the United States, if you think about places like the Texas Panhandle.
I'm sorry, Professor, we're having a little bit of a... Professor, excuse me. We're having just a little bit of problems. If I could just ring you back. We just have a little bit of trouble on the connection.
Sure thing.
Bye-bye. Folks, bear with us. Bear with us on this. Not sure what's going on, but...
Hello?
Hi. All right. Hopefully that's better. So I had asked you, you had characterized beef as both a tool for conquest and a justification for conquest. And by conquest, of course, we're talking about the genocide and the displacement and of Native Americans at this time.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And what I mean by that is that for much of the American West, it was an area considered initially, in particular, way too dry to farm. And so at times in the mid-19th century, it was a place you might want to cross over to get to somewhere like California, but it wasn't quite sure what you could do with this land. And at some point, Americans started to look around and they saw the bison. They saw lots of bison thriving, and they wanted to hunt those. But then they started to look at their cattle, and they thought, we could graze these on a large scale and just replace these bison with our cattle. And all of a sudden, they had an economic reason to use the land. They had a way they could make money out of it. And to them, this was a kind of higher use for the land than, say, either hunting bison, as American Indians were doing, or the kind of highly mobile agriculture they saw. So they both wanted to make money out of cattle, and they viewed that as making it legitimate to seize the land from American Indians. And they would not have been able to do this without the rise of this kind of range cattle industry.
Who were the they in this instance? And to what extent did they have other... I mean, can you go into a little bit of the sort of the perhaps the other sort of economic reasons why they would want to settle? I mean, it just seems like on some level they're looking around for, a solution to a problem that isn't there. unless that problem is, how can we exploit more? How can I amass more cash?
Right. Well, I think the motivations of these people is kind of hard to figure out. I wrestled with this as I wrote the book. So I tell the story of a woman named Susan Newcomb, who's born in the Midwest, and as a teenage bride moves with her husband to the very remote part of Texas. And I read through her diaries and I try to understand, well, what are they doing here? What is their plan? And to an extent, there was an idea that moving to a place like that could give you a fresh start. You might not have had, you might have been a second or third born in the Midwest, not getting the family farm. You could kind of create your own land. But, so at first a lot of these people are engaged in things like hunting. So they're hunting the bison, and we see a lot of crossover between kind of small-scale cattle ranching and bison hunting. And we just see a lot of attempts to basically play out the logic that had happened in the East Coast of the United States, right? The whole logic of the United States was based on acquiring land for farming, and once your area gets settled up, you kind of move farther and farther west, and eventually it got to these dry areas where you had to embrace something like cattle ranching.
I see. And then, so following that sort of that change that took place there, tell us what the relevance of, how reservations sort of played into this dynamic.
Well, one thing that I thought was interesting is I thought there was a kind of straightforward story of basically a violent story of the United States military essentially seizing all this land from American Indians, kind of opening up a vast canvas that then settled by American citizens. What I actually see happening is a kind of on-the-ground, small-scale process of people moving into places, taking land, and kind of fighting back and forth. So early cattle ranchers are almost like paramilitaries in some places. Then, towards the end of this process, they create this reservation system where the majority of land is taken by the United States. Many different American Indians are forced onto these very small parcels of land. And so I thought maybe that's the end of that story. But what you actually see is that the means for many of these American Indians to support themselves off the bison, they're gone. So they're forced onto this land that they can't really farm. They have no way to support themselves. And so the United States government starts supplying them with beef handouts, rations. And many times the lucrative contracts for these handouts come from ranchers. So this reservation system becomes an early subsidy. The ranchers then see these American Indians who are relying on, what they call handouts or rations at the time, and they say, look, these people can't support themselves. What we've done here is justified. So they look around and see this reservation system. It both subsidizes them and justifies what they've done to them.
So there's sort of like a classic self-licking ice cream cone. We put them in a position where they cannot sustain themselves, and then say their inability to sustain themselves is exactly why we've had to put them in this position.
Exactly. And of course, you see that kind of dynamic all the time with dispossessed and marginal populations as a justification from the more powerful.
And how does that just happen? I mean, do people just sort of like develop that as they go? How planned is that notion?
That's a fascinating question and one I thought about a lot. To some extent, there was a big picture plan. I more see it, though, as often if you look at what's happening in these kind of remote forts and outposts, what you actually see is they mostly want to just avoid conflict, but all of their assumptions and ideology matches the assumptions and ideology of these early ranchers. So whenever there's a conflict with American Indians, they obviously side with the ranchers and farmers. And so it's a kind of piecemeal process, but it all aggregates and matches up in kind of their big picture assumptions about what is justified. And behind everything is the assumption that we're using this land productively, therefore we can claim it.
Right. I've heard that somewhere before, actually, in my discussions with modern day libertarians, looking back on why their property rights trumped the indigenous people's property rights. But then,
interesting.
So moving from that era, we move into this sort of era of which ends up being a sort of a false start on some level of corporate ranches. Explain that dynamic and where are we in terms of time at this point?
Okay, so in our story, we're We're talking earlier in the 19th century, so we're talking 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. But the story really takes off after the American Civil War ends in 1865. And so some of this is happening in the 1860s into the 1870s. And by the late 1870s, 1880s, investors from the American East and as far away as places like Scotland say, we could try to turn this ranching thing into big business. So they move in with lots of money, and they see 100 herds of 1,000 cattle, and they say, we can make this into one herd of 100,000 cattle. And where you dealt with hundreds, we deal with thousands or tens of thousands. And so all of a sudden, this becomes the hottest new investment of the 1880s. Everybody's starting up these ranches. You see these kind of millionaire playboys from places like England moving out west, and this is kind of their like toy business. But you also see this running on very sound business principles. The problem is people are a little too exuberant, a story we see oftentimes in the history of American capitalism. And everybody basically is over-investing, making bad deals, and the whole thing kind of blows up. So the big corporate ranch doesn't really take off because there's this big boom in cattle, and there are some disastrous winters in the 1880s. And at the end of that story, just when this is all falling apart, this boom and bust cycle, there's these firms in Chicago that start to think about how they can slaughter cattle in Chicago and distribute the meat fresh all around the country. And when everybody's going out of business, they're buying all their cattle, and all of a sudden these small companies in Chicago turn into global behemoths in the late 1880s.
Okay, so wait, so let me just stop there and just so we should also say, like, this period of time is I just remember this from as a kid watching Bonanza and the Ponderosa, right? This was basically the story of the Ponderosa on some level, right? They were cattle ranchers. Yeah. And so, okay, so where is, when all these people are coming in, presumably after the Civil War, and they're coming in, they're pouring all this money, like, where's the market for this? Like, who is eating this beef and how, right? At that point.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So basically, most of the cattle, or there's a lot of cattle in Texas. And there's cattle all across the U.S., but the kind of surplus of cattle in Texas is the key to this story. So before the American Civil War, there had been some ranching in Texas, and Texas was linked with New Orleans, east to west. The American Civil War basically ends that trade because the Union doesn't want that happening. And all of a sudden, there are these cattle just accumulating in Texas doing their thing, right? Grazing, reproducing. And during the American Civil War in the 1860s, all these cities in the North are getting huge, and they're developing a national market. Chicago's a big city now. New York is getting even bigger. Boston. And so there's all these hungry people in these cities in the North, and all these cattle in places like Texas and kind of remote areas in the West. So as of right now, there's no way to really link those two. But these big ranches realize, hey, if we can move cattle quickly from Texas or Wyoming to Chicago, we can get rich. And so that's that kind of story you're telling me. So this is where you get the kind of famous cattle drives of the Old West, moving hundreds of thousands of animals to places like, Kansas to get them into the rail lines into Chicago.
And then in Chicago, presumably they go into the slaughterhouse and then they get sent to the east. Is that the idea? Yeah. So in the early part of this story, Chicago is just kind of the center of the rail network east. So the animals go alive to Chicago, and then they spread out alive to cities around the east coast of the U.S. But starting in the 1870s, these savvy business people in Chicago start trying to figure out how to make a refrigerated rail car, essentially a moving refrigerator. It's kind of a disaster at first. They crash a lot. They try to hang the meat, and it swings too much, and the cars topple over. But eventually they work it out. And all of a sudden, instead of shipping these live animals all around the country, which can be expensive, they can do everything in Chicago, centralize all the business, and very quickly and cheaply send it everywhere fresh. And that's how these businesses capitalize on everything that's happening out west to take over global meat from Chicago. And so you end up having this dynamic where because the corporate ranches got too big, I guess, and then they end up basically dispersing, or they had too much, liability. One bad blizzard can destroy their business. Yep. The slaughterhouses become the essentially have like a monopsony, I guess, and they end up controlling the market and therefore dictate both ends of the supply chain, right? Where, you know, what they're going to pay and how much they're going to extract as it goes east.
Yeah, I mean, you've got it exactly right. So the technical thing would be, say, they have an oligopoly, oligopsony. So they are kind of, there's 3 or 4 firms, they control selling to customers and buying. Now, the less technical Texas version of that is to say they have both ends of the string, as people in the period like to say. And what that means is, basically, they can capture all the profit. So they bankrupt, they go around the United States on the customer end and bankrupt all the local people. And so they control the whole supply chain there. And because the ranches, the big ranches have failed, the meatpackers in Chicago kind of dictate what they want to the ranchers, because the ranchers are all small and relatively scattered. And so they become a behemoth. And this mobilizes all sorts of political conversations about whether these packers are too powerful, should the government do something, maybe should they break them up, which is a bit like debates about tech companies today. But this starts a whole conversation about the relationship between business and government.
And there's a couple of at that point. Well, it's interesting, I guess, is like the quote from Sinclair Lewis. He was trying to appeal to people's hearts and missed and hit their stomach. The idea being Upton Sinclair. Sorry, the idea being that he was concerned about the plight of workers in this, and ultimately what really stuck with people was the sort of the quality and the safety of the meat, right? So is that why we get around this time, we're now around the Federal Meat Inspection Act, right?
Yeah. So basically what happens is, you know, there's a story we can tell about these Chicago slaughterhouses. It's a story of kind of business genius and innovation. In a lot of ways, they pioneer what looks like the assembly line. And Henry Ford, in his memoirs, said he got the idea for the automobile assembly line from Chicago, although they called it a disassembly line because they were taking one animal carcass and making it into all sorts of different things.
Right.
And that could be a story of innovation, right? They come up with this breaking it into tasks, but it's also a story of incredible labor exploitation. Because when you break things into individual tasks, very specialized ones, it doesn't just magically make people more productive. It enables you to work them harder, right? So you have people who set the pace, so you pay a little more to work extra hard. You can train people and overwork them because you can replace them easily. And so the slaughterhouse becomes this site of incredible exploitation. And Upton Sinclair becomes curious about this and studies it, and he's a kind of socialist revolutionary. So he writes The Jungle, the story of this immigrant family's toil in Chicago, as the precursor to a revolution. But along the way, he talks about contamination quite graphically, talking about it, you know, a finger falling into a vat, talking about animal feces contamination. And because that's so visceral to people who are eating things, that really becomes the way the public starts to mobilize. And if you think about it, business doesn't want to be regulated in terms of labor standards, but they're happy to work on sanitation issues because they want to restore consumer trust in their product. And so they quite quickly realize that this kind of sanitation is a problem they can, you know, solve to encourage people. And that's how we get that problem.
And we should say also that specialization of the workers completely diminishes worker power, right? Because you become literally a cog in a machine.
Yeah, and so what we see, I mean, in my part of the story, I argue all this action happens between about 1880 and 1900 or 1910. And there are attempts to unionize, but there's a legal regime and a kind of government that's not very sympathetic to organized labor. And so they can't effectively unionize in the key story I'm talking about. Now, in the 20th century, meatpacking workers do unionize, but already their baseline assumptions about the kinds of jobs they have are so kind of eroded by that period I write about. And so, yeah, worker power is quite limited during this period. And then once we get into that sort of like the state regulating both the sort of the health requirements and the hygiene and best business practices, I guess. Following that, there becomes sort of like more questions about antitrust. Yeah. So I like to think of a key actor at the end of my story is Teddy Roosevelt. So if we talk about Upton Sinclair as a revolutionary, Teddy Roosevelt is kind of the perfect politician to tame capitalism, which is kind of what happens. So he's very suspicious of big corporations, but he's also suspicious of organized labor and, what he sees as socialism. And so he says, in order to kind of save American capitalism from itself, we need to regulate it. So he accepts huge centralized meatpacking as kind of an inevitable development. But he says, we're going to, act to regulate them and prevent them from engaging in practices that are too predatory or from cooperating too much. And so he does things like he organizes an investigation of the meatpacking industry, or as they called it, the Beef Trust. When the meatpackers try to say, we're not colluding, we're all going to form one gigantic company, they say, no, you can't do that, and there's all sorts of court investigations starting to limit their power. But in all of this, they accept that big centralized food production is necessary to the world we live in, and that continues to today.
So, how much of this is sort of unique to meat as opposed to just sort of the development that we see? I mean, where is meat relative to other, I guess, products or commercial, things like where, because obviously, we have this story that scholars have been looking at in terms of cotton and it being, closely tied into slavery, but the implications of the cotton in terms of the economy of the entire country, not just the South, but of the East, the Northeast, and around the world to a certain extent. The cotton, because of that dynamic of slavery and the free labor, and it begins to drive everything. Like where does meat, like, I guess, rate relative to cotton within that sort of ecosystem?
That's interesting. I like to think of it maybe as the questions of the early American economy and its exploitation and how it works in markets. Cotton is kind of the product to understand that. I think in the late 19th century, beef ends up being the perfect product to understand the challenges of the late 19th century American economy. And that's in part because it's so complicated to produce and distribute. So the fact that they want to distribute it fresh, people like fresh beef as opposed to some other meat products they might eat cured, because it has to stay fresh from Chicago to New York or Chicago to Boston or Chicago all the way to London, there's all sorts of challenges businesses face in coordination. Similarly, because cattle have to be produced far away, they're rural animals, there's all sorts of questions of coordination to get the animal from, say, Texas or Montana to Chicago. And all these challenges mean that the meatpackers are figuring out these complicated questions of supply chains and distribution that create a model that then are copied in all sorts of industries, right? So they figure out how to efficiently slaughter an animal without it spoiling and pioneer the assembly line. They figure out how to distribute fresh products, which then becomes important to distributing fresh fruits and vegetables, which oddly the meatpackers actually control in the early 20th century. And so all these challenges, the beef packers kind of pioneer the solution that then gets taken up by other people. And that's why I think understanding the history of American beef is so important.
What was driving the demand for meat? I mean, I understand, like, it's just, I guess my sense of that era was like, oh, meat is a luxury. You don't see it that much. I mean, obviously because of the challenges you're talking about, but I'm trying to get a grip on, I would imagine that someone in that era, particularly in the mid 1800s, sees like, look at this massive country. And if I could put railroad tracks down everywhere in this country, I could own like everything. I could, go in and speculate on real estate because I have control of over transportation. I could speculate in real estate all across the country. I could look at destinations. I could look at places that we're going to have to pass through. But I need something to send by rail, and I need a commodity. And in terms of like going east-west, and I'm asking if this is if there's an element of this. Like, beef seems to be the thing. but there isn't a market for beef. How do we juice this thing? Like, I mean, how much of a market was there? Was this something that, like, we're going to, figure out how to downscale beef? I mean, because we have a version of this, right, in the early 70s when the Nixon administration basically said we're going to subsidize corn, which is going to make everything cheaper in terms of food. Right. And that's going to put more money in people's pockets, and it's going to help the economy, et cetera, which is going to help all these industries. I mean, of course, in the mid 1800s, there wasn't so many different sort of layers into making that determination. But how much of it was like, we're going to use beef as the thing that's going to sort of open up. We're going to create a market with that, but it's going to open up all these other markets for me.
Well, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think from the viewpoint of the railroads, the funny thing about the story is, in terms of this fresh beef slaughtered in Chicago, the railroads are initially very skeptical. They don't want to get involved because they have such a good trade shipping live cattle all over the U.S. And so they force the meatpackers to develop their own ideas, their own refrigerated rail cars. And all of a sudden, when that takes off, the meatpackers are holding all the carts. So in a way, they become more powerful than the railroads. But to get to your point about why meat, I've thought about this a bit, because I kind of wondered, well, say they start producing all this beef, presumably they got to convince people to eat all this meat or to want it, right? And what I realized when I started reading about what beef kind of meant to people is that for most of the people who were immigrating and coming to the U.S. or already living in the U.S. in this period, they already had a pre-existing preference for fresh beef. Fresh beef, in a way, was a special occasion food. And so people were used to eating it on feast days or special kinds of holidays for special occasions. And so what that meant is, if you could provide them with this thing that had been expensive, so they only had it on special occasions, if you could provide them that cheaply, they would want to turn that special occasion food into an all-the-time food. And so the story and consumption becomes this occasional food becoming a dietary staple, and higher expectations in terms of quality. And so that just ensures that as much as you can produce this, in the late 19th century, people are going to consume it. Now, as we saw, beef consumption peaks in the 1970s in the U.S. and has come down some. But through that period, just anything you can produce, people will want it, and that kind of makes the distribution of beef, which is bulky and heavy, a perfect thing to distribute in a national rail network.
And so where does that leave us now? I mean, when we're looking at the story of sort of the, I guess, the political economy, where is beef's future, and what? I mean, I guess, what lessons can we learn in terms about the way that decisions were made going forward? I mean, the labor stuff seems to, and we're going to play an interview next week about the car industry, and so many decisions about logistics were made basically to diminish the power of labor.
Right.
It doesn't feel like that was as conscious of an effort in this instance, because the labor was so sort of, in some ways, except for in the slaughterhouses, removed in terms of the process of which stuff was being built. But, delivered. But, I mean, how much of that is, what is the lesson we're learning from this?
Well, I think there's kind of, I've thought about this some since finishing the book, and I think there's kind of two key things. I mean, the first is that labor is a major issue in terms of the slaughterhouse, and there's all sorts of fights in my period, and you still see it today. I mean, with these recent raids by ICE on these facilities in the South. So still kind of marginal labor is important to this business. But as far as lessons today, I think the key thing we see with industrial food, and it's pioneered in the beef industry, is that low prices to the consumer become an overarching organizing principle and a justification for things are done. So when people say, hey, this is exploitative of labor, or this is destroying local environments and communities, people from the industry say, well, that's what we have to do to provide cheap beef. And because the whole system is organized around that, then any change to that system is in fact going to raise food prices. And making food unaffordable is not exactly a good policy solution. So I think one of the insights is that changing these things is going to make it more expensive, and that ties into a much broader question about a more equitable society. So beef will become more expensive, and people need to be better able to afford it. And beyond that, in terms of Go ahead.
No, I mean, is that used as a mechanism to prohibit reform? I mean, it sounds like
definitely. It is. Yeah. So in the 19th century, and then I'll tell you about the present briefly. In the 19th century, you see that people are investigating Philip Danforth Armour, one of the biggest meatpackers, and he basically says, we have to do this. If you want to feed the urban masses, feed the common laborers, he said at the time, these are the rules we have to play by, and that's how he avoids regulation. Today, if you think about increasingly in debates about the Green New Deal, where people are saying we have to think differently about beef production, basically often critics of that are saying, that they're coming for your hamburgers. They're saying you're not going to be able to afford your hamburgers anymore, and that turns a kind of consumer concern to deflect a criticism of how it's produced. And so you see that parallel even today.
That's fascinating. And do you expect more of that? I mean, where do you see the future? Is that basically it? We need to, if we're going, we as a society are going to have to make a decision.
Yep. Well, I think the other point, though, so that is a concern about all sorts of industrial production and commodities. The other thing, of course, is the environmental impact. I mean, all the evidence suggests that society needs to reduce its meat consumption dramatically, and that has to happen over time. But in the short term, we have to think about the impacts of that. And so the worst cases in terms of climate change is deforestation in Latin America. And while American beef production is kind of not directly coming from that, there are potential trade deals that are happening between the United States and Brazil that could put some of that meat on the American table. There's a whole conversation about beef and climate change that I think we have to be thinking about now that my characters weren't thinking about in 1880.
Well, the book is Red Meat Republic, A Hoof-to-Table History of How Beef Changed America. Joshua Specht, we will put a link to your book on majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.
All right, folks. We're going to take a quick break, head into the fun half, wherein we will play the Larry Kudlow, who has had time to marinate from the earlier conversation he had with Chuck Todd.
Time to soak in the info. That reminded me a bit of, do you guys remember that documentary, King Corn?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think I interviewed those guys.
You must have. But I think that would have been Air America days, right? It's a while ago.
Yeah, but I think I interviewed them later. I'm not quite sure. But yes, there was a couple of documentaries about corn at that time when people understood the sort of the implications of that big agribusiness. And of course, I think if you were to do an updated version of Red Meat Republic, corn would play an outsized role.
Huge role in it. And it would be interesting to do a through line of the rationalization from these meat packing plants to Amazon. My other thought.
Just a reminder, it's your support that makes this show possible. You can become a member by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. When you do, we give you extra content every day. During the break, even, people are going to have access to the deep archives. Brendan has been thumbing through the pages of our deep archives, picking out stuff that he thinks is going to be interesting for people. When I say deep archives, I mean deep archives. I'm talking almost over a decade old. No, over a decade old. It's very interesting stuff. Back in the day when Air America launched, the Majority Report was in its first iteration. We had some super high-powered guests at that time. So you have access to all of that by becoming a member. Plus, you'll get the free show without commercials. But as always, you can find information about the commercials in your podcast notes. So if you want a deal on something, you check that out. Michael, tonight is Monday. That means tomorrow is Tuesday.
Yes, indeed. And on Tuesday, we're going to be talking with Shahid Buttar, who's running to challenge Nancy Pelosi in the Democratic primary. I'm going to obviously be really interested in his ideas on foreign policy and how he might represent a change and rupture in that regard and how his campaign fits with the broader movement. Then
he came in very close last time around. I mean, was only in the race for the last 3 months of the race. and in the primary. Now he's starting out a year ahead.
No, he's clearly got real chops. And I mean, I've actually been seeing that there's some other candidates in the mix, some of whom seem pretty appealing as well. But he does seem like if somebody's going to pull off a completely Herculean upset like that, it seems like he probably is the candidate to do it. So I'm looking forward to talking with him. Anna Kasparian's going to join us, and we're talking about that incident that we played of the ice truck in Rhode Island, kind of trying to basically drive through the protesters, and how we can correlate that with the state initiatives that Republicans have pushed to essentially criminalize protest across the country. Of course, Kashmir, Argentina, a whole bunch more. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks to our first 70,000 subscribers on YouTube as well. And see us in Chicago this weekend. Still tickets. Grab one.
Jamie's out, but I know she recorded a new Antifada yesterday. So go to patreon.com/Antifada, the Antifada, to check out what they got going. And her side project about vampires. Real vampires.
On Literary Hangover this weekend was the second weekend in a row with a new patron episode, George Orwell shooting an elephant, and we problematize Orwell and cancel him. So look, that's fun for patrons.
I was wondering what happened to Orwell.
Oh no, he's going to stick around. We don't really cancel him, but we do talk about some.
Just do a little probation, right?
Yeah, he's put into a Burmese jail for a little bit,
just to reflect
because of his lack of deepness in his representation of Burmese subjects in Under the Raj. So,
folks, you love your dog, right? Well, you want to know more about you. I mean, unfortunately, your dog cannot say like, "Oh yeah, no, I was born in Chicago." And my dad was a terrier. My mom was a golden retriever. It was beautiful. They were not supposed to get together.
The oral traditions are not strong.
Not strong in dog. Well, that's why Embark Dog DNA Test Kit looks at over 250 breeds and 170 genetic health conditions to help you care best for your pup. So not only can you find out the origins of your puppy or dog, and also, you can find out what things to look out for. You know, dogs have a lot of genetic predispositions to different diseases, to different, and certain foods are better for them. If you love your dog, you want your dog to be around for as long as possible. An Embark Dog DNA Test Kit is the best way to do it. And right now, for our listeners, Embark has an exclusive summer offer you can't get anywhere else. Go to embarkvet.com. Use the promo code MAJORITY. You'll get 15% off your dog DNA test kit. It will allow you to discover your dog more than fur deep. There you go.
It's a great idea.
Embarkvet.com. Use the promo code MAJORITY to save. Check it out. Also, just getting this breaking news. It seems like the cop who was involved in the Eric Garner choking and death, Daniel Pantaleo, has been fired by the New York Police Department. No criminal charges as of yet. But but he is gone, and that's important. That's an important development. Overdue, but sometimes the wheels of justice move slowly. The guy should actually be on criminal trial. I mean, without a doubt. But at the very least, the New York Police Department has severed its ties. All right, quick break. Fun half. 646-257-3920. See you there. Left is best. Jamie and I may have a disagreement.
Yeah, you can't just say whatever you want about people just because you're rich.
I have an absolute right to mock them on YouTube.
He's up there buggy whipping like he's the boss.
I am not your employer.
You know, I'm tired of the negativity.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. you're nervous, you're a little bit upset, you're riled up.
Yeah, maybe you should rethink your defense of that, you fucking idiots.
We're just going to get rid of you.
All right.
But dude, you want to smoke this joint?
Yes.
Do you feel like you are a dinosaur?
That's good shit.
Exactly. I'm happy now.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win-win.
Oh, hell yeah.
Now listen to me. 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 847-906-501-457. 2, 38, 56, 27. 1/2. 5 8s. 3.9 billion.
Wow.
He's the ultimate math nerd.
Don't you see?
Why don't you get a real job instead of spewing vitriol and hatred, you left-wing Limbaugh?
Everybody's taking their dumb juice today.
Come on, Sammy!
Dance, dance, dance.
Rand Paul.
I had my first post-coital scene with a woman. I'm hoping to add more moves to my repertoire. All I have is the dip and the swirl.
Fine, we can double dip.
Yes, this is a perfect moment.
No.
Wait, what?
You make under $1 million a year. You're scum. You're nothing.
Excuse me? Fuck you, you fucking liberal elite. I think you belong in jail.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. You're a horrible, despicable person.
All right, gonna take a quick break. I want to take a moment to talk to some of the libertarians out there. Take whatever vehicle you want to drive to the library. What you're talking about is jibber jabber.
Classic. I'm feeling more chill already.
Good. Donald Trump can kiss all of our asses.
Hey, Sam. Hey, Andy. You guys ready to do some evil?
Hitler was such an idiot.
That guy might be a Nazi.
Agree.
No.
Death to America.
You.
Yes.
Wow.
Wow, that's weird. No way! Unbelievable. This guy's got a really good hook. Throw our hands up. Ooh. Wow.
But Sam, I gotta get off.
No worries. Let's. I want to just flesh this out a little bit. I mean, look, it's a free speech issue. If you don't like me...
Hey, shut up!
Thank you for calling into the Majority Report. Sam will be with you shortly.